Hello, Oregon Country Fair. Hello, Sunday. Hello, 2022. Hello, being outside without masks. Hello to hugging each other. Hello to you. Come and listen to the history of this place and this river that we share, this watershed that we're in. Watershed moment, that's what this is about. The interesting thing about the programming here at the Rabbit Hole is we have 2 toms in a row. The first one's the long tom, and then after this will come the short tom with a lot of short people. But we're going to start with David Turner. Please welcome David. David's written a book about the long tom, and you're going to learn a lot about the history and the geography and the people. And also a special guest, Ann Rogers. Welcome.
Special guest. All right. I like that. Okay, so welcome you guys, familiar faces, and there'll probably be some few more people dropping in here. So it's great that the Long Tom River is on so many programs at the Country Fair lately. I think that's really remarkable. At Stewardship, they have stuff going on. And I was just talking to Anna at Energy Park, and she was thinking, oh, maybe we ought to do a program where there'll be a parade mimicking the flow of the river through here or something. So some creative stuff, creative thinking going on. The Long Tom River sounds like a very simple topic, but it's pretty complicated, really. It's not complicated, but it's complex. And I started learning about it when I served on the board of the Long Tom Watershed Council for about 7 years. And then they came out and did a project on some land, on the land I live in outside of Junction City, and primarily all about increasing the fish passage through the little Owens Creek that we live on. So I got to know them really well, and then got involved with the board and just fell kind of in love with this river. So I ended up writing a book about it. You know, I got it so involved with it, I started researching it and interviewing landowners who lived around here, found out about the long, long history of people who lived out here. And that's where Ann's going to help us a whole lot, because Ann is the archaeologist at the Oregon Country Fair since the beginning almost, but she's also been working on archaeological sites throughout the Willamette River watershed.
All along the Long Tom too. Yeah. I just found out, since you live outside Junction City, we're having a whole nother talk.
Yeah, okay. So Ann and I kind of at least worked on a project for the Rabbit Hole, or one of the programs here 3 years ago. So I got to know her, and then all of a sudden I got involved with another water piece here in the Cascades called Fish Lake. It's up near the headwaters of the McKenzie River. And so we did a book kind of styled after this Long Tom book about looking at the place and looking about the history of the place and how the space has been used over time in many different ways. And helped on that too, because the Forest Service hires archaeologists to look at all the lands that get disturbed, get used, and try to preserve all the good things about the landscape. So, you guys all know, but I brought a map to show where the Long Tom River is. And there's a little map up here for people to know. But the most interesting part to me is that it flows in all directions, flows south, east, a little west, and then north again. It is really a river in 2 parts. It is the upper Long Tom that starts up at, above Low Pats off of Highway 36. You go about 5 miles up there, and in this book there's some GPS coordinates about pretty close to where the few springs come up year-round, feeding the creek that feeds the river. So we think we know where the Long Tom headwaters are. And it comes down and through some big wetlands south of Highway 36 around Poodle Creek Road. So it really starts to fan out the way most of these rivers do out here, as they really flood in the wintertime and then recede in the summertime. So there's a lot of floodplains out here that get enriched with the soil that gets moved in from the water pieces. Then it takes a big left turn at no tide, which really presents some evidence that there was quite a few logging mills, temporary logging mills, up along the upper Long Tom, where they would be up in the hills and slide logs down slippery paths or sometimes little bitty creeks, get them into the Long Tom, and kind of float them there for a while they're being waited to be milled. Then, as it flows south of Highway 36 and takes a left turn at Veneta here, going north, heads into the Country Fair property. And, you know, the Country Fair has, I think, been one of the models of how to care for this landscape here in terms of trying to understand how to nourish the landscape and how to manage it so that it retains a lot of its original structure and original kind of intent, which I think goes back exactly to how the Native Americans, particularly the Kalapuya, lived here. They learned the landscape, learned how to adapt to it, instead of learning how to change the landscape to adapt to them. So the fair is the perfect kind of character to do that again. Then it flows into Big Fern Ridge Reservoir. And I think that's where the upper Long Tom and the lower Long Tom connect, because everything north of the dam is considered the lower Long Tom, and it has a whole different kind of hydrology to it and different uses of the river there. So we're going to talk primarily about the lower Long Tom today, although Ann's going to talk about the connections in Fern Ridge and here at the site too.
Yeah.
I hope so. So one more bit about the introduction is I think just kind of in general, I think to keep in mind that there's kind of some components of what a watershed is. You know, watershed primarily is where it's kind of like a big V, and everything that flows in towards a big body of water is a watershed. So most main rivers are the center of a watershed. So there's a Long Tom watershed, it flows into the Willamette, then there's a big Willamette watershed that has different sub-basins, flows into the Columbia, which has different sub-basins. So everything is trying to see how the land and the water really can be in the best harmony, how they can kind of flow together and not be interrupted with too much change. So when you look at a watershed, I think you can look at it from at least 4 different ways. One, you can look at the kind of long history, the geological nature of the watershed itself. And that has a lot to do in this region, particularly up in the upper part, is that there's been a lot of changes of the earth, where there's been a lot of rain that has kind of made when the glaciers came through 50 million years ago, it would soften, as the glaciers started to melt, it would soften the earth, and it's primarily sandstone and basalt around here, and sometimes those pieces start to shift a little bit. There's a good example on the upper Long Tom where the landslide has happened and it pushed the Straight River out into a big U, so it made an oxbow out of the river. There's also a pretty interesting geological theory from 2 geologists from 1949 that said the original Long Tom flowed from up above Low Pass directly south and west into the Siuslaw River. So the Long Tom would have been in the Siuslaw watershed until another earth change blocked that creek, changed the direction of it, and it started flowing south. That was of interest to me when on Owens Creek, I tried to find the headwaters of Owens Creek and went up into the hills west on High Pass Road and kept going up and found pretty much where I think is close to it, the headwaters. And then I compared that to the headwaters of the Long Tom River. And so I found out that they both start up there around Low Pass, and they're about a half a mile apart. And the Long Tom flows south and goes this way. The Owens Creek flows directly west and goes this way. And where they connect together, it takes 4.5 miles from Owens Creek, 9.5 miles to Owens Creek, and it takes 50 miles, or 40 miles for it to go from its original headwaters to meet. So that could severely change the course of the river another way. So geological features is one way to consider the watershed. The second one is the kind of human habitat, the people who have lived in the watershed valley. And primarily that goes back to probably about 10,000 years ago. 10 or 11,000 years ago.
Well, that's what we have evidence of.
Yeah, but probably good chance that it goes much earlier too.
Yeah.
So trying to track how people have lived for 10,000 years and see how, I think, little they have changed the earth and how much they have adapted to the watershed here is amazing. How much we have changed the watershed in our last 200 years of occupation. So the occupation started with the Native Americans who lived here primarily winter and summer. And I want you to talk after a while about their kind of living habits. But then when the settlers came, first the fur trappers came in the early 1800s and started exploring the roads and finally made the first California-Oregon highway that went right down there, down Territorial Highway. So this is really part of a historic thoroughfare from north to south. And then the settlers came in the 1850s when the land grant program happened. So they would come out here, settle a piece of land, and get 640 acres if they were married, and start their big farm. And that is what really started pushing out the native peoples here and moved them away. But even before the settlers come, even the fur traders started spreading the diseases. So there were a few people to be moved, but still all those who were left pretty much got rounded up and moved to the Grand Ronde. Thirdly is the kind of environment of a watershed. Every watershed, has a different altitude and a different base formation. And so the environment can be really different. We have a certain type of tree, certain types of trees that grow here, and undergrowth. There are certain mammals and birds that like this part of the Cascades versus the northern part of the Cascades or the coastal range. So the environment is quite different in each watershed. And then finally, I think there's kind of an economic use of a watershed, where watersheds are usually tried when you consider the big aspect of the earth or the land formation there. A lot of times there's going to be a big competition for economic development, for either paving the surfaces, so there's a lot more hard structures and putting roads in, and then finally putting buildings in and settlements in, where the land has moved from a place where wild plants grow, they are foraged by humans and animals, to agricultural farms or vineyards, which also there's some place for those these days. So not to say that they're necessarily evil, but there needs to, I think, always, I may use this word a little too often today, but there always needs to be some balance between what's being done to the land, how we change it, and how it should change us. So that's the watershed idea. With all those things in mind, we can kind of focus in here a little more detailed about how these grounds around Fern Ridge Reservoir and the country fair being used. And so I'm going to turn this over to Ann for a while to talk about that.
Okay, so as we said, this land, we have, from archaeological sites, we have radiocarbon dates going back almost 11,000 years. So that's a continuous occupation until the diseases start to affect this. And the way the Kalapuya worked is each watershed was a band. And these bands had distinct languages, well, distinct dialects of the same language. Up at Art Park today, there's 2 volumes of English to Kalapuya, and you can look up your English words and see what they would be. But they're also identified by dialect too, so you can see what dialect it was. The best evidence for Kalapuyan language is now with the Tualatin band and the Yankala band, because those are where the last speakers were. This is the homeland of the Chalamela band, or as we say, Chalamela. And by the time the treaties were signed, this band was extinct. Everyone was gone. And because that's 1855 when the treaties, begin to be signed. And so they suffered a lot from the colonialism that went on here. One of the wonderful opportunities I've had is to work as an archaeologist from here at the country fair all the way almost to within a half mile of the confluence with the Willamette. And most of this is private land, but I was fortunate enough to work for an agency that worked with private landowners. So I got to see all that stuff. And anyway, and so
I'm sorry.
Gonna take a 10-second break here, I think.
I'm the reason she cracked it.
Anyway, and I can't trust him. And he's a wonderful person. Anyway, so this is a very rich environment when you look at it. So the way I look at it is you have the biodiversity of the watershed with your Douglas fir forests on the uplands, your oaks, your grass fields, your wetland prairies, which have your camas in it. You can have wapato in it. You can have tarweed in it. You can have all these subsistence things. And while I primarily am talking about food, it's not just the food. It's the plant foods. It includes the animal life. It includes the deer, the elk, the beaver. You need to get that beaver to get those beaver incisors to work your wood, to carve wood and stuff like that. And so there's a lot going on that often doesn't meet the eye. And in many ways, it was a managed landscape, and it was managed for all these items. It was managed for basketry. It was managed for the different food resources and stuff. If you've been lucky enough to drive past on the highway in May when the camas is in bloom, both here and at Fern Ridge, you just see fields of blue. And I always consider this the upstream edge of the Long Tom Marsh, which is basically occupied now by Fern Ridge Reservoir. And the marshes are really important economically to the traditional people, no matter where you are in the world. You can think about the marsh people in Iraq. You can think about the marsh people along the Malheur River. You can think of the marshlands, because these are where your resources are. Your plant resources are concentrated. Your animal resources are concentrated. So what happens here is we have here a large variety of camas ovens. These camas ovens are like 2 meters across when they're excavated. The University of Oregon excavated a number as part of the highway project, and we've also found them in profile along the river as they've eroded out. And they have and they'll be about this deep from here, I guess that's about 3 feet. And they would have gathered, they would have started a fire, put rocks in to help the air circulate, put what I call greens in, because everybody who processes camas from here, British Columbia, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, they all have some green they put in, and then they put their food in it. It protects their food. More greens, more rocks, more fuel, and they cap it and they cook for a couple days. And what happens to the camas is it changes it and makes it to a usable food source, and it's sweeter, changes it to a more sugar base and stuff like that. Or if you want to try camas today, you can put it in a Dutch oven at 200 degrees for 24 hours. And you'll still get that caramelization. And then there's the onion-like skin on the outside, and then inside is the part that they actually dried and preserved for the rest of the year. If you go up to Ark Park, you can see our little calendar that tells what resources were important in that, and it's not exclusively those resources. You took what you needed when you could get it. So what happens with, and there's also acorns and hazelnuts in these ovens too, because I think one of the things that happens that's overlooked here is the other varieties of foods that are available to these native people. And so when the settlers come and this colonization begins, you've already had the diseases and everything have affected these people before they've even seen anyone, before the fur traders. And so they end up, very few people left in an area by Junction City, which is why I'm going to get to you on that, is I've worked with a private landowner that in their family, they homesteaded 1854. They remember, the family lore is that the Kalapuya was still there, just a handful of them, just literally a handful of them. And they remember them the weekly baking of bread. And all of a sudden, knock, knock, knock on the door, can we have some bread? And that, they were still going through the area on their rounds. And this family also has a history of remembering that they died. They died from diseases. They were probably some of the last of the band that was along the Long Tom. And that family buried these people, and so for them it's a very emotional thing. And I've been working with them for a couple of years, volunteering with them for a couple of years on helping them preserve the oral histories that relate to the original homesteading by that family, which is quite interesting. And because it's threatened by development, and a lot of this land is threatened by development. This property, if it was not part of the Oregon Country Fair now, even though most of where we're sitting now is the floodplain, would still be threatened by development, because the current floodplain maps, they change over time, and areas that I had assumed on the earlier maps were undeveloped, you couldn't develop on, are now eligible, and you can develop on a floodplain. It's at your own risk kind of thing. So this rich archaeological heritage that we have, that the Oregon Country Fair stewards, becomes even more important as these other areas are lost. And every place there's a confluence. Here we have Indian Creek. Duh, there must have been Indians here, and every place there's a confluence, there's sites. At the confluence of Amazon Creek and the Long Tom, there's sites. So it's a very rich heritage that is often overlooked and poorly understood. And so that's part of it. I don't know, what else should I talk about?
Well, you're talking about sites right now. Tom Connolly and U of O did a lot of work in this little region where Coyote Creek and Spencer Creek connected with the Long Tom River, and they found lots of sites down there. Talk about that for a few minutes. Okay,
so any place, like I said, any place there's a confluence, because you want fresh water, because whoever's upstream from you from the Long Tom has already dumped their. You don't know what's going on upstream. I see people looking at the Long Tom just yesterday going, oh, this is so neat. I just want to jump in, and I'm going, ew, you don't know what's going on upstream from you. But when you have this smaller creek that comes in, there tend to be lots of sites because you know where that water comes from. And so they're all in that basin, and when you start looking at the confluence of creeks along the Long Tom, you start finding sites everywhere. And these sites can be anything from low mounds to, they've been described as low mounds, and just plain scatters of stone tools, low mounds, and then what they call Calapooya mounds, which are burial mounds. There's never been a Calapooya mound excavated that didn't have burials in it. There's one off of the Calapooya River, to just kind of go to the other side of the valley for a second, which was excavated in 1989, which you can see from I-5 if you know where to look, and it had 23 burials in it. So, because the description on Calapooya burial practices from the pioneer days is that they would wrap you in a blanket and then put dirt on top of you, because any of you here who have tried to dig this soil at the wrong time of year know what it's like. So, that's part of it. So you have the Calapooya mounds, the low mounds, which I think are deflated mounds, and they don't have evidence of burials because of the acidic soil. And the lithic scatters are food processing sites like the ovens we have here. So here we have, on the Oregon Country Fair property, we have an uplands, and those are the more permanent habitation sites, and these are the field sites. I like to think of it as this is your 5-acre rural residential lot, if you're in contemporary lingo, and you live up on the highlands, and this is your farm, because you don't have 5 acres in a Yama, you have 5 acres in a camas field and a tarweed field and the birds and everything else you can get. And so that's how I look at it. In the time depth, I'm reminded of Catherine Harrison, who was one of the people who got the Grand Ronde re-recognized, and was tribal chair for a number of years. I had the opportunity to drive her around, and it was right when Kennewick Man was found in Washington, and I go, and the Indian and the tribes in the Umatilla and Yakima were discussing the ancient one, is what they called him, and they really didn't know how old he was. And I said to Catherine, so how long have you people been here? And she said, forever. And I said, that's great, I'll go with that. So when I say 11,000 years, I'm thinking, we don't really know. As the environment's changing, and the environment has changed here before, we've had mini ice ages, we've had drier, drier times, and it's changing now. As the ice in Alaska and stuff is all being exposed, we are seeing that there are many more ancient sites, 30,000, 50,000. If we have 30,000-year-old sites in South America, it's not like they skipped over Oregon. So as a discipline, I think that archaeology sometimes misses the big picture, focusing on these little elements. We know things change through time. We know this stuff. We know that there was a Clovis occupation here. That is not the oldest occupation. In fact, the dates we have from the oldest site in Western Oregon on this property predates the Clovis sites here. We also know that Clovis in Mexico, from the site Fin del Mundo, is much older than Clovis anywhere in the United States. So these people are moving, everybody's moving, just like, we move today. And I don't know. What else?
A couple of things, questions for you about that is when they found the mounds with burials in them, what did they do with the remains? Did they offer them back? Did they rebury them?
Well, from 1989, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but there would have been a discussion with the tribes.
Yeah.
There's along the Willamette, just after the Long Tom enters the Willamette, I know that a burial was discovered on a farmer's land, and they reburied it in place. So it's easy. It's one by the Long Tom and the Willamette landowner I worked with. He goes, "These are the mounds," and I go, "Okay, good." And he goes, "I want my pipeline to go all the way around them, because my dad said, don't go near those. It's bad juju, and so I need to get the wells here. The irrigation's going to be here. I want to go like this." I said, "Fine, I'm with you on that. I want, and so part of this is building awareness and, and educating people as to what's going on. And so I know that the mounds that were originally excavated in the 30s and 40s, most of that ended up even earlier, most was done by amateurs and ended up in private collections. And there's very little access. But if you know anybody who has a private collection of artifacts from the Willamette Valley, the best thing to do is to either contact the Grand Ronde or the Siletz, and they will they have a process for reburial or using those repatriation.
When I hear about sites being found around here, archaeological sites, it brings the question to my mind about where are the Kalapuya living, and I'm pretty sure that it's very seasonal about where they are. So there could be people who are living here during the winter time. But then in the summertime, they would travel up into the cooler climates in the mountains to either have kind of long-term camps as they hunt or trade or gather resources. Is that about right?
Yeah, but there's always someone probably here because they are too old or too pregnant or some combination of that and don't want to go.
Yeah.
Because there's still resources here. You got all your berries and
in one of the Tom Connolly reports, they talk about just imagining what the house would look like where they live, the domicile, because it's all made out of natural reeds and bark and materials that are not going to last long at all. So there's really not much evidence as to how they actually live. Just kind of, you have to fill in the blanks, don't you?
Yeah, you'll find the fire hearth, and you'll find the post holes if you're lucky, because they'll be, and if a house burned down, you'll be really lucky because that post hole will still have charred remains in it. But unless you can recognize these subtle soil differences from decomposing wood to the surrounding soils, it's very hard to see. So you're looking for clues. You're looking for the fire hearth, and many times this stuff is being thrown away from the house because you don't want to live in your trash, and neither do they.
Yeah. So let's move on a little bit further downstream and kind of look at how the river's changed a little bit. So once, we'll still come back to stuff in the.
Yeah, I think the river's changed a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
It's changed a lot from agriculture.
Yes.
I mean, once we get to the lower Long Tom, it's definitely been highly affected by agriculture, by channelization, by building berms to keep floodwaters back, and just a variety of agricultural practices.
So when Fern Ridge Dam was constructed in 1941, finished in 1941, it was primarily built because there were floods all up and down these new developing towns of Bonita and Elmira and Junction City above and Monroe. And so the Corps of Engineers decided to dam up the river right at this place where, and this is a real interesting map from the 1854, 53, that shows these creeks coming together, and on this it marks swampland. Those rivers are so low that it's always damp down there. So they felt that was the lowest piece in the valley to dam to build up this reservoir. But they built it, and within 2 years they found out that all the roads south of the dam were still flooded. You know, it really didn't help much at all. So during that time, I think the answer to any solution was heavy earth-moving equipment. So they got through there, and they got their big dredgers and went down Long Tom River, and pretty much straightened out all the oxbows, and made what they have called the Long Tom Ditch from the Long Tom River. It was just the kind of thing that they hoped they controlled the flow of the speed of the flow of water, so it wouldn't be so damaging. However, I think what they did in that was quite damaging to the environment. They didn't do hardly any plantings along the banks. The photographs we see of the dredging just is pounds of earth, you know, on the raw earth on the banks there. So they're going to be washed away pretty soon. Rains are going to wash them back into the river, and then it just will start silting up again. And so one thing that they've been trying to do on the south side of the dam is, with landowners, try to get the landowners to start opening up the outspouts again so that they can unstraighten the river. And one of the nice examples that's in this book is just right south of Franklin Road. Art Johnson, a prominent attorney in town, but he took some real beautiful photographs of the restoration they did, creating new water habitats for birds, for beavers, for all the kind of animals that Ann was talking about that really makes an environment healthy. And he did that just by working with the Long Tom Watershed Council and using the right kind of materials to open up the straight ditches and turning them back into original rivers. And I got a feeling that's what's gonna have to be happening around here on the fair property, and everybody who's walked the river route, Strawberry Lane here, can start seeing how damaging the river is to the banks of the country fair property. There's right below Archaeology Park, maybe 500 yards or so, is one of the big trees that just tumbled this winter, that a maple tree that was anchoring. It was planted, I think, about 45 years ago, is anchoring part of the bank, but the bank was wet, the tree was heavy with moisture. Never had they pruned any of the leaves on the river side, because actually that's helpful for the water to cool it down, but it just created more and more weight, and so it tilted the tree over. A big root ball shows up back here, and you see this huge divot, this big cavity on the banks of the river now that is ready to be churned away as the next high waters come here. And I think, I know the fair's trying to deal with this, it's a big, serious problem. And for one question that I think Ann's probably thinking about is, maybe the banks along in front of Archaeology Park may disappear, and you're going to have to find the fair's going to have to reconfigure itself in some ways.
And we're working on that now, and relocating things, and also thinking of what kind of plantings we can put in. I have taken cuttings, and I actually rooted them and replanted them along some pieces of our park, and they're actually doing really good. And somebody said to me, well, you got to do more of this bank. And I go, oh, okay.
Plantings of what? What are they?
I planted, oh shoot.
No,
My mind
that'll be a
is
mystery for
blank.
us later on.
My mind's a blank.
But shrubs.
Dogwood. I planted dogwood.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
And it's doing really good. And I just took a cutting from about 50 feet downstream and nursed it for a couple years in my backyard, relying on my high school botany from the last century. And so, you know, there is a lot that can be done. The current site manager, she is very eager to begin some of these restoration activities and, you know, and work towards that end of stabilizing it, because what you really have to do is stabilize upstream from where your erosion's happening and do some protective measures that way.
So Dennis here is part of the land use planning committee at the country fair, and so he's been dealing with this a lot. And a little bit later, I think at 3 o'clock, you're going to give a talk over at Stewardship about management purposes. So to learn more, go here to Dennis speak. He knows about that.
I might interject here. What we have decided to do is let the river do what it wants, and we move instead of forcing the river to.
Yeah. I think the Kalapuya will be proud of you. I think they are the ones who say, you know, you got to watch how land and water comes in balance, and we should be in balance with that. Yeah.
And because the way that someone doesn't want the river to move, you know, me putting plants in, that's a soft approach, and an event can wipe them all out. And a hard approach of armoring a bank and bringing in heavy equipment and excavating and hardening is a very destructive thing that takes a lot more to restore and is extremely expensive. So soft hardening through plants, and then hoping that the river kind of goes with the flow.
Yeah.
Isn't that it, Dennis?
Don't fight it. Yeah.
Well, at Archaeology Park, the river is moving 2 feet per year. It's eating away the bank. 2 feet per year has been.
At the very, and
50 years is about 100 feet.
but we're going to become an island, and we want to be an island.
So we just have a few minutes left here, and we want to invite any questions you have here as well. But one more thing about the kind of wetlands and the stuff downstream is that to remind you that this is a flood zone during the winter time. There's some pictures up here of, you can see, you know, flood down the aisles, you know, on the map that the country fair uses, that right now everybody's walking down. You can go down these in a canoe or a kayak during the winter times in the high water. And that is common here, because I found this nice old photograph from about 1900 of the marshland that is between Elmira and Veneta. And the easiest way for them to get was the long bridge. And they had a long wooden plank bridge where people would walk between the two towns. And in this case, it's 4th of July and they're marching with bands on the way. So they must have done something just like marching down these paths during the winter time. One thing that's been in the news recently, a very unfortunate thing, is there was an accident on the Longtom River down close to Monroe, where a young couple were put their kayak in the water. They were going to float from about Ferguson Creek, from about a high pass road into Monroe, where there's a pretty easy takeout there. The river's not known for floating very much, but I canoed from Monroe all the way to the confluence one time, but it was brushy in a lot of cases. It was hard to get through. But so this couple was out kayaking, and they came across unexpectedly from a nice slow-moving water into about a 5-foot concrete dam where the water was flowing just as fast but sped up as it went down. So they unexpectedly went nose deep into this pool of water that had been scoured probably about 10 feet deep underneath. So they got pushed down by the current. The current kept pushing these people down, and they couldn't survive. They couldn't get up from that. And they were found a day later and 2 days later. So there was a terrible accident on this river. And it was mainly caused by these things they call drop structures. And they're concrete dams that were set up to try to help the water flow faster so that it would continue to get to the river easier. The Army Corps of Engineers did this both in the 40s, right after the dam was built. The biggest one is right at Monroe. If you pass through Monroe, you can see it where, and this was one of the old mill buildings they had there. But further up the creek is the Strota Dam drop structure, where they the couple drowned. And then further up that was an old structure at Cox Butte. And if you drive down Ferguson Road from Junction City towards Monroe, on the left-hand side you can see another drop structure. And it looks like a good fishing spot there, and I see people fish there every once in a while because it's kind of real fast and cooler water. But it's a dangerous piece now. And so, and here's an example of why they built those structures. Here is a natural flow of the river where they had a great, the long tom going to Ferguson. There's a beautiful ambling curve to the great structure, moving the earth, and they cut off this flow and this flow and just made it straight with two ditch there. And then, so right in there to try to move that water, they built the drop structure. So they're trying to do this for some kind of purpose, but it's really not something that's for everyone's purpose. It's for only the Corps of Engineers trying to manage the water. So the steps right now, here's a pretty dramatic photograph of the family kind of returning to that site, trying to figure out what happened, and they've really been advocating for the county and the Corps of Engineers to put warning signs up finally. So I thought I had a picture of the warning sign, but they just put up these kind of handmade warning signs there that are temporary, but they are now at every bridge over the Long Tom past the dam. So it may prevent that some kind of terrible accident like that happening again.
One of the things is from the 1920s through to the 1970 was not just the Army Corps, but a lot of engineering of the river for a variety of reasons. Flood is one, but also for farmers who we can increase our production if we clear cut to the edge of the river, if we, and to also, depending on their water rights, to pull it out. And it's a very heavy-duty mechanical thing, and when you read through old extension bulletins from 1920s, they're busy telling farmers in the Willamette Valley how to fix their river. So
and it's all relative. Chris?
I have a friend that goes across the main road to go down to the coast and owns a bunch of land there. And he's been working with the nature conservancy and with people for he's got accounts of it on his land. And he's really done a lot of planting. So it's going back to where West. And my question was, the people who live on the Long Tom, do they usually cooperate with people trying to?
Well, in my experience with the Long Tom Watershed Council, who've reached out to all the landowners on all the river and all the creeks, in some way they've reached out to them. I think about 80% of them respond favorably and want to help. There's a few people who just don't like any invaders on their land.
it
So I tell you
depends
what,
how much money
okay.
you're offering them.
Okay, we really need one quick question and then that's it, okay?
Just wondering, back in the 19th century, how much of the channelization and management of the Long Tom was to accommodate steamboats, and how what's the furthest upstream the steamboats that would have reached them?
They did do some widening of the Long Tom right above Monroe, and the first steamboat that came to Monroe was in about 1885, where they had a flour mill there, and they unloaded docks onto the boat. Then in 1904, a steamboat again tried to come up and got stuck because of all the silt in the river, and then they said it's too much maintenance and it's not, they can't do it any longer. I think it was, I'll tell you, it's in this book. it's the man's name who ran the store and everything else. Okay, and speaking of which, this book about the river, if you want to know more, is over there on the shelves. And also we have this nice new book about Fish Lake, which is another project kind of like this that deals with the Kalapuya natives adapting to the land and us taking their place. So if you have some questions, Ann and I will be around out here while the next group sets up, right outside. And here's some little maps that I'll display up here if you can help yourself with, so you can learn about where the Long Tom is. And on the back, it tells you how the Long Tom River got its name, which is a real good story. So if you get trivia, win a question. Thank you. Thank you.